was born to two parents, Sydney George Rachlin and Natel Bendersky Rachlin, who are each remarkable people and very, very different. My father was the child of Russian immigrants. He was born and brought up until he was 12 in New Britain, Connecticut, with a huge and very loving and connected extended family. Their values were education, family, Judaism, and hard work. My mother was born into a large family also of Russian and Austria-Hungarian immigrants in Selma, Alabama. And each of her parents had seven siblings. They were one of eight. And life in Selma, Alabama during Jim Crow was extremely difficult, particularly for Jews, because they were certainly on the side of the civil rights movement, but had a very difficult time being explicit and otherwise actively and visibly involved because of their livelihoods and businesses. So she grew up with the scourge of racism and was herself quite an activist. She, among other things, took black people to register as soon as the Voting Rights Act was passed, and tried to talk the poll workers into waiving the poll tax and the literacy test. And my dad was a lifelong civil libertarian, a very committed seeker of justice in every dimension. He was one of the liberators of Dachau, and never forgot what he witnessed there, and really encouraged me, nay, exhorted me to really stand up to injustice whenever I encountered it. And so I had not just permission, but in my DNA, I was very committed to human rights and human rights movements. And so between that family background and being a child of the 60s, I was ripe for activism, and I embraced it wherever I found it. When I was, I think, 5 or 6, I went to my first demonstration. We protested the execution, or the approaching execution of the Rosenbergs. And I remember being part of a circle of people who silently walked in a circle at our public library protesting their execution. Clearly, growing up in Selma was formative and transformative for my mother, because we were brought up to really fight racism. And my mother, again, wrote a letter to the Selma Times-Journal saying, why is it that the streets in the white part of town are paved and the streets in the black part of town aren't? She would constantly berate friends, neighbors, and relatives for allowing their domestic staff, that's what they were back then. There was nothing pretty or nice or fair or just about it, to sit in the back of the car when they drove them home, to sit in the kitchen while the family ate. She was just, a very outspoken person, which did not stand her in good stead in Selma, Alabama, but which modeled for me that you don't, when in Rome, do as the Romans do. You become a change agent and you stand up and fight for what you believe in. And so she modeled that. My father was extraordinary in many ways too. He was one of the few dentists in South Florida who would treat black people. He was the only dentist in his town who would work on prisoners in the county jail. He just felt that we were born to relatively great privilege, being middle class and white, and that it was our obligation to help those who were not so privileged. And he founded the library in Hallandale, Florida. There's still a plaque with his name on it. Spent a large part of my childhood going around to bookstores, libraries, homes, picking up books for this brand new library. So again, our family values were activism, social justice, Judaism, family, and education. Unfortunately, neither really did share too many stories. Fortunately, my dad lived till 95. He died 2 years ago. My mom is still alive and going strong at 90. And because my dad lived so long, and because his family has extraordinary reunions, they got into family stories about 30 or 40 years ago. They had a cousins club for the last 70 years, but my dad in his later years became active in it, and I'm now very active in it. So there is a huge and long family history now that includes his stories, and he interviewed many of his uncles and great uncles. So there's a very rich treasure trove of stories from his side. my mother has told me stories about the civil rights, but there it wasn't hard to quickly get a fix on what was happening, that she was, she stood out like a sore thumb in Selma, Alabama. And her father, who was my beloved Poppy Nate, was also so sympathetic with the civil rights struggle. But his brother Jake was in business with my grandfather, and they came to Jake and said, you either join the Klan or we'll put you out of business. And when Uncle Jake reported this to my Grandpa Nate said, I'd rather be put out of business. But Jake joined the Klan and the Citizens Council, and he was mortified, and never went to any meeting and never did anything, but he had been basically threatened, and really he had a lot of people to support. This was this family of 8 siblings and parents and grandparents. So when my grandfather died and they closed their store, my mother found white robes in the attic of the store, Klan robes. So, and I befriended a young black woman before the Civil Rights Act was passed, and I guess it was the late 60s, or no, it must have been the early 60s, and we decided we'd play tennis together in Selma, and we couldn't go to the club because blacks weren't allowed. It was only recently the Jews had been allowed. So we went to a tennis court behind the high school, and by the time we finished playing tennis, my grandfather had gotten 3 phone calls saying that if that damn Yankee granddaughter of his didn't watch out, she'd be hanging from a tree. And we couldn't go to any restaurant together in town, so I brought her to my grandparents' home for lunch. So these were lessons that are very indelibly imprinted on my soul. So the first thing I remember about the 60s was in junior high school when when the war there started to escalate. And I was president of the student council, and they wanted me to write an editorial on my feelings about Vietnam. And clearly these were pre-internet days and pre-24/7 news cycle days. And so I talked to my dad about it, who was kind of my touchstone when I had difficult things going on, my mother as well. But in this particular category, I talked to my dad. And he said, it's very complicated. He said most issues in politics and foreign affairs and life are complicated. And he said he did not agree with the domino theory, but that, it was really difficult, and he didn't know where he came down yet. So I wrote this editorial where I tried to see both sides. And I look at that now and I'm ashamed of myself. I mean, not ashamed, but surprised that I, kind of more embrace the government's, if as goes Southeast Asia, so too will go all of Asia, in particular because our family had a very strong socialist background in both Russia and their early years in New York and New Jersey. And we always were taught that to each according to his need, from each according to his or her ability. And so, but I wrote this very quote unquote even-handed editorial, and now I look back and feel like that was my last gasp of even-handedness. And from certainly from high school on, as soon as I understood civil rights and women's rights and gay rights and environmental rights and almost every other rights movement, including disability rights, I was there. In college, it was the height of the Vietnam War, and I remember the night of the lottery when a lot of my classmates got either high numbers or low numbers and were either celebrating or terrified and lamenting. And I went to 2 demonstrations on the Washington Mall. I was tear gassed in front of the Department of Justice. And I was powerfully affected by an experience at Dartmouth that included a foundation at Dartmouth, which was the social justice foundation called the Tucker Foundation. And there were, among other things, intern programs. And I decided some students did semesters abroad, but I decided to do a semester in Jersey City, New Jersey, working on anti-poverty programs for Title I and Model Cities. And Dartmouth owned a home there, but since I was the first class of women who had transferred, there had not yet been an amendment to their charter to allow women to matriculate as freshmen. They didn't want me to live in the Jersey City home with all the men. They thought it would be a breach of faith with the community, so I lived in a convent. And this was the era of Black Panthers and, riots. The Newark riots weren't that long ago when I moved there. And I just saw incredible poverty, incredible racism, the northern brand rather than the Selma, Alabama brand, and it was no less horrible and odious. But the combination of the anti-war movement, the lottery, my work in Jersey City, really working with the Tucker Foundation and meeting a mentor, a man named Mike Balin, who has been a major force in my life, just sealed it for me. And then it just kept going. I became very interested in feminism, very interested in women's health, became a very active pro-choice advocate and activist, and met Judy Nersijan early on. We used to share a lot of, we'd be in the same place at the same time, and she certainly spurred and reinforced everything I was feeling about women's health. So it was part of a whole. It was the air we breathed, both at Dartmouth, and I had started out at BU as a freshman, and those were heady times. And had I not been in Europe that summer, I would have been at Woodstock. I was just as my father said, a flower child, a free spirit, and a pretty ferocious one at that time as well. I started at BU and loved it, actually. I was in a wonderful program that was an integrated approach to education. I really liked it a lot. My best friend from Hollywood, Florida, was a student at Dartmouth. We were the same age. And he wrote me and said that Dartmouth was going to begin admitting women on an exchange basis and I should apply. I had been to visit him twice and fell in love with it because it was this picture postcard, idyllic New England town and just a beautiful college. And having come from Hollywood, Florida, which was flat and hot, this wonderful area with mountains and lakes and streams and peace and quiet and cows just was very appealing. And so I applied thinking I'd go there for a year and just have an exchange experience, but it ended up that I loved it, and because I got so involved with the Tucker Foundation and the Jersey City program, I ended up staying. There are very difficult parts of the Dartmouth experience that involved coeducation and being the first class of exchange students that were, sometimes harassed and sometimes coveted for the wrong reasons. And so, but that's another whole chapter. But I survived, and I survived with this great love of the hills and the mountains in New Hampshire, which is still a great haven for me.
So what would you say were the major lessons you were taking with you as you were emerging into young adulthood?
Certainly the stand up and be counted. Certainly the if you're not part of the solution, you're part of the problem. Certainly the notion that, it's that amazing poem by Niebuhr. They came for the trade unionists, and I wasn't a trade unionist, so I didn't stand up. And they came for the gypsies, and I wasn't a gypsy, and they came for the Catholics, and they came for the Jews, and finally they came for me, and there was no one left. And I just always believe that we are put on this earth to help each other and to be there for each other, and that was just the role that I had taken on for myself really almost as a child, as a young person. I just was hardwired to be a helper, and then I got that reform bug at Dartmouth, and just have always felt that I don't want to ever lead a life where I'm an observer. I want to be in the thick of things, and to the extent that I can be a change agent, even on a tiny scale and with small steps, I want to try to be a change agent. Well, when I was young, we took to the streets, and we believed in protesting, and we believed in boycotts, and we believed in taking over administration buildings, and we believed in making noise, and the power of numbers. And clearly it made a huge difference with respect to the Vietnamese War. And I'm very proud to have been a very active part of that. Many sit-ins and teach-ins, and again, the two protests I attended, two largest protests on the Mall in Washington. as I aged, I understood that, and certainly went to law school, and I went to law school because I did see myself as an activist and wanted to continue to try to make changes, but I came to understand that protests have their limits and certainly aren't a uniformly effective tool. And so I started to be very interested in law reform. And that sometimes works, and quite often it doesn't. We all know about the vagaries and political fixes in Supreme Court, at least the one of today, and other courts and judges. And so I've come to a much more nuanced view of change. I mean, sometimes you have to be out there with your placards, and sometimes you have to be in a small room with your law books planning a case, and sometimes you have to be, donating to candidates. And now I understand it's a very multi-layered and complicated business, but I still believe that grassroots change is the mother of all social change. And the hard part since the 60s is that there isn't an ongoing organized movement for anything. And we thought we had won the pro-choice battles, and they're certainly a bigger struggle than ever, and there's no one to organize because younger women really grew up with this privilege of choice and never really had to fight for it. So now it would be a matter of remobilizing, and that's for almost every ism, sexism, racism. I mean, clearly the gay rights movement has been a wonderful vanguard for all of us activists, because they have really kept it alive, but certainly the women's health movement has not been able to, and certainly the anti-war movement has not been able to, and environmental rights are struggling to, which I think is the most important issue of our century. Like all journeys, it's often a twist of fate, as Bob Dylan said or sang. I had moved to California after my college graduation and wasn't sure what I wanted to do. I mean, I initially wanted to work with kids and just wasn't sure, because of the Jersey City experience, largely teaching and working in that inner city. I wasn't sure where I was going. So I took a year and a half off, moved out to California, decided I really missed the East Coast, came back, and decided to go to law school again to try to find a grounding for my activism. And I became very interested in health law because in my pursuit of a degree at law school that might help me work with kids, I took a course called Children at Risk. That was taught by Leonard Glantz and George Annis and a beloved pediatrician at BU named Joel Alpert. Leonard and George were both health lawyers. And this course touched me and grabbed me really like none other. I fell in love with the issues. I took it because it dealt with kids in the law, but it was really mostly about health issues, organ donation and consent and competency and all of these issues with children. And it also dealt with special ed, and the law in Massachusetts, the special ed law 766 was just being argued and hadn't yet passed. So it was this confluence of my love of kids, my interest in activism. It just felt like a wonderful niche for me. So I decided to switch from juvenile law to health law, not that there were any formal majors, but at least in my mind and heart. And so at the end of my second year of law school, I went looking for a summer job. And at that time, there really wasn't much of a field of health law. It was hospital law or malpractice law, neither of which particularly interested me. Malpractice law did eventually become part of my portfolio, but certainly on the side of patients. But at that point, patients' lawyers were few and far between because it was already a real uphill struggle. So I did find a little announcement posted in the law school placement office from a law firm called Chayette and Sonnenreich, which was very close to where we are now sitting in Park Square, Boston. And it was a law firm in a small brownstone in Bay Village. And there were 4 lawyers. Neil Chayette was the founding partner. Michael Sonnenreich from Washington, D.C. was the other named partner. There was a man named Michael Morrell and Harvey Freistadt, who is still one of my dearest friends and certainly a beloved mentor. And this firm was very involved in representing a number of physicians and hospitals in Boston and greater Boston and Massachusetts more widely. And there was so much going on at the time. Not only had the National Research Act been passed in 1974, 1 year before I began working there, but there were a lot of prosecutions in our state, which made the practice of medicine here difficult and for some physicians downright dangerous. So 4 physicians, 2 from BU, 2 from Harvard, had been doing research with fetuses. They were asking women who were considering therapeutic abortions to take an antibiotic for a week or 2 before they had the terminations, so that the researchers after the terminations could examine the tissue and find out how much of the antibiotic had crossed the placenta. And clearly this would have helped women who were pregnant who needed antibiotics if they knew whether it was safe for the fetus. And it would have also helped fetuses who developed infection or inflammation in utero and needed treatment. So this was important research. But because Boston was then a very strong Irish Catholic state, and the legislature and DA's office were very staunchly anti-choice, these 4 researchers were arrested, indicted, put in the back of cruisers. They were fingerprinted, photographed. They were treated like criminals. And our law firm, Chant & Sonnenreich, was representing them. Similarly, Ken Edelin, who was a hero to the women's rights movement, a beloved OBGYN at Boston City Hospital, whose life was committed to helping poor women and women from communities of color, performed an abortion in the OR at City Hospital, and there was a right-to-life nurse or technician, I don't remember the specifics, who said that it had been a live-born birth, and that the fetus had been born alive and the alveoli had moved and collapsed, which was allegedly a sign of having taken a breath. And he was prosecuted for manslaughter and convicted, and it was only overturned on appeal. So this law firm in which I worked was really very much in the thick of things. Although they didn't represent Ken Edelin, they were advising the person who did. The research atmosphere in Massachusetts was certainly affected by what was going on nationally, which was that the National Research Act had mandated the formation of IRBs. And nobody knew what an institutional review board was. They were also called human investigation committees. They were called research ethics committees. They went by a number of names, but basically they were a committee that was to review every proposal for research and to find out whether it was not only scientifically responsible and sufficient, but ethically sufficient as well. And this was mostly a response to the Tuskegee abuses. In 1972, a journalist had exposed the fact that for 40 years, poor black sharecroppers in rural Alabama had been followed for syphilis. And even though penicillin had been developed after the war, these men were never offered penicillin. So a curative drug that was cheap and low risk, low adverse effects, no adverse effects to speak of, widely available, could have cleared up their syphilis and cured them of the very terrible symptoms and side effects of the disease. They were never given it. It was a study to look at the natural course of syphilis. So when this was exposed, Senator Kennedy, along with several other justifiably outraged other lawmakers, including Sam Ervin, said, something has to be done. What was done was the National Research Act. And the part of the National Research Act that was hopefully going to prevent future such abuses was the development of an IRB system in every single institution receiving federal funds, so that unethical research such as this would never have passed muster. Chayet and Sonnenreich was in touch with the medical schools, with researchers individually, and people were struggling to figure out what all this meant. And they decided to bring everyone together in their offices just to try to brainstorm and find ways to approach this scary new world in a much more collaborative fashion. And there were several meetings at which they all said we need to really keep meeting because no one can figure this out alone. We are a very high stakes city. There's a lot of research here. We're a mecca. People look to us. If we blow it, it's going to be much worse. And if we do it right, it's going to have a reverberating effect throughout the country. So they decided to form PRIM&R, Public Responsibility in Medicine and Research, whose initial goal was to educate both the public and science and the scientific community about ethical issues in research, about responsible research, but also to help, more explicitly, to help the public understand why research was valuable. Because after Tuskegee, there was a huge backlash by the public. They didn't trust scientists. I mean, these government scientists had truly abused and neglected on both ends these poor black sharecroppers, and trust in science was at a near all-time low, maybe an all-time low. And the lawyers and certainly the medical establishment here understood if it didn't turn around, it would affect grants, it would affect the ability to recruit subjects into clinical trials. It would have a very chilling impact on the conduct of research and certainly the practice of medicine as well. So PRIM&R was founded to help the medical and research institutions here try to do a better job so that they could regain the public confidence, but at the same time let the public know about the good things that science and research were doing, so it wouldn't just be the horrible headlines that caught their eye and breached their trust. So in '74, with the National Research Act, it did require the establishment of an IRB system at every institution, but it also impaneled a national commission called the National Commission for the Protection of Human Subjects of Biomedical and Behavioral Research. And part of that commission's mandate was to look into several special populations that needed or might need special protections, like prisoners, those who were mentally incapacitated, decisionally impaired, fetuses and pregnant women. But another part, and the part that has proved most enduring, was to write an ethical framework that IRBs and other researchers more generally could apply when determining whether a research project was in fact ethical. And this remarkable commission, it really was remarkable. It was headed by an OBGYN from Boston named Ken Ryan, and each commissioner was inspiring in her and his own right. But this commission came up with an extraordinary report called the Belmont Report, which is the Bible of our field, and which in effect gives this framework with three guiding principles for the review of research and for the determination whether it's ethical. Its main author was a man named Tom Beecham, who is now a professor of philosophy and bioethics at Georgetown at the Kennedy Institute. And it's a very elegant document and one that has stood the test of time.
PRIM&R was incorporated in December 1974. And what was the organization's mission at that point as it was being formulated?
The mission was to educate all of the stakeholders in medicine and research. The title reflected that mission, Public Responsibility in Medicine and Research, to educate all of the stakeholders, and among those mentioned were academic institutions, IRBs, the federal government, the public, sponsors, drug companies. They wanted everyone to come together to be educated because they understood these founders were very visionary, and they understood that if it was siloed, if the field remained siloed as it had been, then the goal of ethical research and responsible research would never be met. That it was a multidisciplinary field, and it was going to take a multidisciplinary approach to ensuring that no more Tuskegees, no more, Mengelas, no more Jewish chronic disease hospital, no more Willowbrooks would ensue. So I only came 1 year after it was formed, but the bylaws were the same. And basically there was a board, and the board, when I arrived, was the founding board. These remarkable men and women who had signed the Articles of Incorporation. And the bylaws were, I would say, very standard for a nonprofit educational organization formed circa 1974. there was at that time a president, which has now been changed to a board chair. There was a vice president. There was a recording secretary. There was a treasurer, which was a joke since there was no money back in the early years. And there were requirements for meetings, requirements for what was considered the number of members required for a motion or action to pass. There were requirements about notice for meetings. Clearly, this all predated not just email, but the internet and certainly even personal computing. There was an old Selectric typewriter in the office when I arrived, and you used whiteout and lift-off correction tape, and it was quite a different scene. And I remember the first facsimile machine we got, which was this giant clunker. And we thought it was magic that somebody could send you something from hundreds, if not thousands of miles away, and you could receive this smelly, smudged, but still somewhat legible document. There were, I believe, 9 people who signed the Articles of Incorporation, and they came from a variety of sectors, medicine, research, and some university arts and sciences people. The prime movers at that time were a man named David Nathan, who was a pediatrician at Children's Hospital, later became the chief at Children's Hospital, who was really understandably concerned about the fetal research arrest and indictment of these 4 researchers, because fetal research was a very important part of understanding, pregnancy, high-risk pregnancy, high-risk deliveries, and because he was head of or not yet head, but certainly active and very invested in research at a children's hospital, that was his main driver. A man named Sidney Gellis, who was a pediatrician and later became chief of pediatrics at the Floating Hospital, now part of New England Medical Center, Tufts New England Medical Center, similarly very concerned about fetal research. And our law, unfortunately, included neonates, which were newborns. So not only could you not do fetal research, but you couldn't do neonatal research, which means you couldn't do any kind of research on normal newborns in Massachusetts, which was very unfortunate. They couldn't test bilirubin levels. They couldn't test, any kind of intervention that would have helped newborns who were struggling. I think, but honestly can't remember, that it was because the right to life establishment was so strong in Massachusetts that they felt unless they included newborns, an abortion could be performed and there might be a quote unquote product of an abortion, an abortus that they alleged might have been used as a subject of research rather than aggressively resuscitated as an infant. And this is what led to the prosecution of Ken Edelin. Again, Ken Edelin was ultimately exonerated on appeal, but he had been convicted of manslaughter. And I think the fear of the right to life was that if you didn't include neonates, then these mad scientists, these mad Dr. Frankensteins would grab these abortuses, from ORs or from physicians' offices where abortions were being conducted, and would use them in some horrific experiments. I think that was the justification. Fortunately, PRIM&R and some of our partners were able to get the neonate requirement out, but it took us 10 years. It took a very long struggle. So it was all driven by abortion politics, the inclusion of neonates. So Sandy Chodosh, who was then the head of the research IRB at Boston City Hospital, he was a pulmonologist, was involved, and again, that's where two of the researchers had come. There was a woman named Marissa Hecht-Orzak, who was a social scientist. She was involved in neurosurgery research. Neurosurgery had been a huge part of the ethical debates in the early 70s, because in one of the Scandinavian countries there had been some very unethical neurosurgical procedures done, lobotomies in effect. And these were the cuckoo's nest years, where there was a lot of abuse of those who were psychiatrically ill, and certainly those who were psychiatrically ill, poor, and institutionalized. A man named Joe Cochin, who was a wonderful, wonderful researcher from Boston University, a man named Dana Farnsworth, a lovely physician who had been working in Boston, but I don't remember at what particular institution because he was retired, but he had been a lovely senior statesman for the group. A woman named Gloria Tinder, a man named Robert Bradley from the Joslin Diabetes Clinic. And I think that about rounded out the group. From what I can gather and from what I've been told, Neil Chayat, this lawyer who is a brilliant, visionary, charismatic, dynamic, tireless activist, lawyer, knew all of these people and got them together. But I think what might have happened is that he might have reached out to, I think what did happen, to very high-level people at the main teaching hospitals or the teaching hospitals in Massachusetts, Harvard, Tufts, BU, UMass Medical Center, and said, we'd like someone to come represent. Those were the medical schools, and they all have associated hospitals. So he put out the call, we'd like to have a representative come to this inaugural meeting. We're going to talk about what to do with these regulations, what to do about these prosecutions, what to do about, there was a drug law that was also being passed, 94C, where anyone given a scheduled drug had to be reported to the Department of Public Health. Their name had to be submitted, so all kinds of privacy concerns. So I think Neil knew some of the original founders, but I think some of them were sent by their deans or provosts to be the institutional representatives at these gatherings, these very new and hopefully important gatherings that they all wanted to be, they all wanted a seat at the table. So I was hired in 1975 originally just to be a gopher at this law firm. I mean, I was a second-year law student. There really was nothing much I could offer. I was learning the tools of legal research, but certainly there wasn't much I could do beyond or in addition to that. Neil had just started a radio program called Looking at the Law, which is still on. And so my first few months there, I think I started in the summer, and maybe for the first 6 or 7 months, I did research and wrote very skeletal drafts of these Looking at the Law stories that he would then amplify and polish and then deliver. I did research for the different lawyers working there, wrote memos. I did some administrative things. I filed. I mean, I was, go where needed kind of Girl Friday. And then Neil started to invite me to the PRIM&R meetings. And once the PRIM&R meetings got going in 74, they quickly decided that they needed a spin-off group to really work only with the chairpersons of IRBs, because the institutions and hospitals and academic centers had one set of problems, but the chairpersons who were really trying to guide these newly mandated committees had other problems. So they spun off a committee or a subcommittee called CERBM, which stood for Chairpersons of IRBs in Eastern Massachusetts. And Sandy Chodosh, the researcher, pulmonary researcher and IRB chair from Boston City Hospital, now Boston Medical Center, then City Hospital, chaired that. So Neil started taking me to both the PRIM&R meetings and to the CERBM meetings to mostly listen and observe. And one of his junior lawyers was a woman named Marian Evans, a terrific woman, who was taking notes and was wonderful. And at some point I became the scribe and the note taker, because she was a practicing lawyer and had her whole caseload. She was just a very competent, lovely woman. I don't know where she lives, but I'm sure she's alive and well. And so at some point in late 75, I started to do things for PRIM&R and CERBM. And again, I'd take notes, I'd arrange their dinner meetings. I've come across some old receipts where dinner was like $5, for these, steak, roast beef, scrod dinners. And I'd have to dutifully collect $5 from everybody, and then they went up to 6 and 7 and 8, and I would, have to call people to arrange it. Again, this all predates certainly personal computers, not just the internet and emails. So I did the administrative work. I certainly wasn't by any means doing anything substantive. I started there in the summer after my second year. So the third year, you are a little bit more relaxed. And I was certainly much more interested in my work at the firm and the real world in general than I was in my courses. So I was still a law student. I think I worked there between 15 and 18 hours a week, as I recall. I was there 3 full days, but not every. They were full days. Maybe it would have been 12 to 8. I quite often worked at night, and had classes in the morning. So by the end of 75, early 76, I was doing more substantive things for PRIM&R. And among other things, we decided that we were making progress as this small group of remarkable people. They were remarkable people in figuring things out, and we should have a conference both to share the fruits of their deliberations and their discussions, but also to hear what other people around the country were doing. And so that little seed was planted in 75, 76, and so they asked me to help plan this conference, or in fact, I think they asked me to plan this conference. And that was an administrative nightmare because there was no way to know who was involved. So what I would have to do is to go to the library and get lists of hospitals and write letters to hospitals. I mean, there was no way to reach people. You could never find out who was doing IRB work anywhere. And through a variety of means, I developed a mailing list and somehow wrote to 200 or 300 people, including the federal powers that be, talking about this conference and say we were planning it. And I started to put together a program with the help of some of the PRIM&R leadership. And I started to put together a faculty, knowing nothing. When I look back, I think, what an extraordinary gift I was handed, because this was the first conference in the field. And no one had ever come together. I mean, clearly the National Commission meetings had been open to the public, and some of those places were wonderful gathering spots for everyone who was interested, but those were quite often the academics, the people who really understood what was going on. It wasn't like come one, come all. It was a very select group.
Was this meant to be a local or regional conference, or people from all over the country?
All over the country, because it was, anyone who is worried, as we are, about these regulations, how to apply them, how to do the right thing, how to balance the science and the ethics. I mean, everyone was really very earnest about doing the right thing. Nobody, at least nobody with whom we've ever worked, was figuring out how to avoid or how to obfuscate or how to do the minimum. It's always just been such a good people, good intentions. I mean, I would not have hung around, but not only did I hang around, but I was totally inspired. So we got this faculty, we got this program. I typed the program, we folded it up and sent it out, and people would send it back with their checks. I think it was $100 a person. And the lunch at Suffolk, we had it at Suffolk Law School, which had been my law school, and the auditorium, and we used the classrooms for breakouts, and 177 people came. And the faculty was quite extraordinary, including Donald Chalkley, who was the then head of the federal office, which was then called the Office for Protection from Research Risks. It's now called the Office of Human Research Protections. He came, and some of the luminaries in the bioethics field came. Bob Levine, who has been an extraordinarily important part of PRIM&R, came. There were just some people there, including Leonard Glantz, my law school teacher and a very important mentor to me. Certainly Neil Chayad, Harvey Freistadt, they were on the faculty. I mean, it was this very diverse faculty because it was a diverse set of problems and obstacles that people were facing. It was April of 77, first of all, just to place it in time. And I think that the two words that I would use to describe it were relief, that finally there was a place to talk about these issues, and confusion, that there was so much changing in the world of research and in the practice of medicine. And people wanted to do the right thing, but had no clue. So everyone had been struggling mostly in isolation. You know, at most institutions, be it hospitals or freestanding research centers or universities, all of which do a lot of research, someone who was in charge of these regulations, usually a provost, sometimes a dean, would say to someone else, often an administrative assistant to one of these deans or provosts, you know, here are these new regulations, go figure them out and tell us when you've figured them out and tell us what we have to do. And there would be this very perplexed administrative assistant, usually they were women, who really were given this very weighty responsibility with no rules, no marching orders, no guidance. And they would take these regulations, read them, and try to make the best of it. And so each institution where research was conducted had been trying to figure this out on its own, and that's an impossibility, because clearly this was a situation, as with any new federal structure, that calls for collaboration and shared problem solving. So there was this sense of relief, and among some people, I mean, I just remember people saying, thank you, thank you, thank you for doing this. And, you know, I was this little, you know, law student, and I'm thinking, what did I do? You know, I just sent letters and made calls, but it meant a lot to people, and that was very gratifying. But the confusion was serious, because there were so many, as with, again, all regulations, there's so many ways to interpret it, and it was purposely intended, the regulations purposely intended. These were, at this point, it was the regulations from the 66 Public Health Service Act and the 74 Research Act, National Research Act, that mandated IRBs. The actual federal regulations hadn't yet even been promulgated. There were draft regulations in 78, 79. They weren't finalized till 81. So at this point, it was just these rules from the Public Health Service and the National Research Act, which came out of Department of, then it was called Health, Education, and Welfare. Now it's called the Department of Health and Human Services. So no one knew how to make anything of these two documents, the Public Health Service and the National Research Act, and the regulations hadn't yet come. So to get together and to see, I walked around to these different workshops, and to see all of the energy and all of the people were animated, and there was everything from, wow, now I see what you're doing and that makes sense, to consternation that nobody quite knew how to approach something. So I went around, and I just remember people huddled, and it was just this extraordinary feeling that bringing people together, you know, it's the wisdom that comes when you listen to each other and when you learn from each other. And that was just you know, that to me was, this is an amazing thing. When you can bring people together, they help each other, they teach each other, they all are sharing. I knew that PRIM&R had hit upon something. And so that first meeting was a eureka moment for a lot of people. Not that they found it, but they at least found a place to talk about it, whatever the it part of, you know, their problems was. Well, Chet and Sonnereich and Harvey and Marion and all the lawyers on staff were involved, and again, they had fingers in a lot of medical hospital pies. The large law firms did have people involved in PRIM&R in the early years. Nancy Rice, who was the Beth Israel Hospital lawyer, was involved. Dan Robles, who was the New England Medical Center lawyer, was involved. And Leonard Glantz, George Annis, and Bill Rollins, who were terrific lawyers and had done a lot of work on the research subject, patient side. George Annis wrote the Patient's Bill of Rights and helped write, if didn't write on his own, the research subject's Bill of Rights as well. George Annis, Leonard Glantz, and And Bill Rollins formed an organization called the Law Medicine Institute, and PRIM&R was very close to them. Leonard Glantz and Bill Rollins both served on our board, and all three of them were frequent speakers at our conferences. So there were plenty of lawyers involved, and they were necessary, and I think it was helpful to them. But we always treated this as something we wanted people to do, not because it was the law or a regulation or a rule, but because it was the right thing to do. And the lawyers were there because it was part of their jobs, but we never wanted them to be a dominant force, not the dominant force, but even a dominant force, because our goal as PRIM&R, or at least my goal, I can't speak for anyone else, was to make sure that people really understood the ethics, because I always believe that if you really think things through and wrestle and struggle and understand, then it's going to be a much more meaningful and wholehearted and ultimately effective way to treat a patient or a research subject than if you're just kind of doing what the rules say. We always said and felt, and the board embraced this, that the regulations and rules were a floor, but we were aiming for the ceiling. We were aiming for doing the right thing and knowing how to find out what the right thing was. No one can tell you what the right thing is. It's always a shade of gray. In most cases, there are no simple, straightforward answers. So learning how to approach ethical problems, learning how to think about ethical issues, learning how to really weigh and balance and listen was what we were after as an organization. So Marian Evans took the notes, and until I started, I was kind of the more general administrative gopher, Girl Friday. And then at some point in '76, I found some minutes where Neil Chad introduced me, or at a meeting where I already knew people because I'd been coming along as just an aide de camp. He introduced me and said that Joan is now going to be the director of PRIM&R and CERVM. And I don't remember whether he discussed that with me or what it meant, but that was the point at which I actually assumed authority. Before that, I had just been a go-where-needed staffer of the law firm who helped PRIM&R and CERVM as needed.
Do you remember discussions about whether this was going to happen or what its implications were?
I do not. I know that there weren't financial implications because, I was paid a pittance, but like internships of today, that really did not matter much to me. I mean, it mattered because I was responsible for my survival, but survival then was a much less costly affair, and I was a fairly frugal person. So I don't think it meant much. I know it meant nothing in terms of finances. It didn't mean anything in terms of my feeling, wow, this is important. It was just he gave me a title, and I remember of the run-up discussions to that. So, but that was, I think, generally coterminous with the time when they told me to plan the conference, and so maybe he had decided, and he still was very much the tour de force behind everything that happened at PRIM&R. So once I had the title, I did feel at least more empowered to go and call people and write to people, and so there was some shift. I had a little bit more skin in the game. And there was no staff at all until roughly, I think our first staff person was hired in 1977. 3 years after the organization's founding, in part because the organization had no funds until after the conference.
Where did funding come from?
So the law firm provided these, Marian's time, my time, on an in-kind basis. And I believe that Tufts, maybe Harvard and BU, and maybe one or two of the hospitals each contributed $1,000 a year. So maybe it was a $5,000 a year budget. But I know that some years I had to collect that in subsequent years, and they could pay, other years they couldn't. I think certainly by 1980, those institutional donations were a thing of the past. They were just seed funds in those first 4 or 5 years to try to provide some, some budget, but it was very nominal. And some of that money also went to the law firm to reimburse them for postage, faxes, telephone, so there was an overhead rate or an overhead contribution. So we hired a wonderful woman named Grace Napier to be our first staff person, and I think she worked like 50% for PRIM&R and 50% of the law firm that I was then part of. Again, when I graduated from law school, I was practicing law with a small firm, separate and apart, 1976. Because I wanted to do civil rights law, and I loved health law, but didn't want to exclusively do health law. So I had a foot in the Chat-and-Sonnenreich world and a foot in a civil rights, prisoners' rights, women's rights law firm. And so Grace Napier was our first employee. She was terrific. She was followed by a woman named Melissa Apperson, another recent college grad who is one of my dearest friends still today. I'm still in touch with Grace today. She's an actor and arts administrator here in Boston. Melissa is a poet and works in a museum. So those were our two first successive employees. They were admin. They helped me. I mean, I was doing a lot of admin. The board was still the font of all wisdom and ideas, and certainly strategic planning, and I was their faithful scribe and go where told and write letters and call people, but I was not a leader in any sense of the word at that point. So Grace and Melissa, Grace first, then Melissa, would write letters, that I would either start on a Selectric typewriter and they would polish them, or I would talk with them and they'd sit there and take notes. It was, the good old days. And they would answer the phone and they would stuff envelopes and, all of those good things that came with trying to get a nascent nonprofit. Our first office was in Chat-and-Sonnenreich. It was actually in the basement in a hallway at a desk. It was dark, sometimes a little moist and dank, not anything that impaired my health, but definitely a basement desk in a corridor. Our second office, we moved to the law firm where I had gone to practice the civil rights, women's health, and prisoners' rights law, and that was on Franklin Street. And so wherever I moved, PRIM&R moved. It was just, at that point, PRIM&R was really a labor of love for me. I mean, I was the named director, but to say that it was an evolved, established, or certainly financially going concern would be a stretch. It was a labor of love, so wherever I went, so it went too. Always maintaining strong ties to Chat-and-Sonnenreich, but clearly at some point, because it was not anything that was still an active interest of theirs, they formed it and stayed involved, but it didn't need to be there physically anymore. So we went to Franklin Street, then we went to Boylston Street, 132 Boylston Street, and we stayed there for many, many years until we moved in, I believe, 2004 or 2005 to Brookline Avenue. And then in 2011, we moved here to 20 Park Plaza, which is in Park Square, Boston. All of the stops have been in Boston and not very far from each other at that. So the staffing was one recent college grad until really, I would say, the 90s, where we might have had two or three. It was always my serving part-time as a director. At some point that morphed to executive director. One recent college grad doing some work in my legal practice and some work for PRIM&R, and occasionally we'd get a summer student or we'd get a volunteer, but the staffing was very, very minimal for the first 15 years, at least, maybe 16, maybe 18. We never exceeded one employee besides me, in addition to me. Quickly, we understood that education was going to be the place of greatest need and thus hopefully of greatest impact. And not that we felt we had any answers, but we felt that we could and must provide a place to ask the questions. So we knew early on that we couldn't really make an impact by being lobbyists, and certainly there were strictures against lobbying after a certain point for nonprofits. They weren't interested in lobbying. They really wanted to be educators. They wanted to be people who, the board, the original founding board, wanted to help those who were struggling in isolation to come together and try to form or try to develop shared solutions. So education was always the principal objective, the principal mission. We did do some lobbying and advocacy, as I mentioned, with the fetal research bill. When regulations came out, we'd comment on them. All regulations, federal regulations, have a statutory comment period. When the National Commission was writing its reports, we'd comment on those. But serving as an educational forum was always the principal goal. After the National Commission, by the way, there was another federal commission called the President's Commission, and they asked us to write an IRB guidebook, and I think that was one of the seminal moments in PRIM&R's developing a national reputation. If the Presidential Commission asks this little upstart organization from Boston to write the IRB guidebook that will have the federal imprimatur of this very, very respected and prestigious commission, then I count that as one of the moments after the first conference where we really felt that we had ascended to a new level of credibility. By the way, after 77, we kept having conferences, and they kept growing, and they kept attracting the highest level of people, both to teach and speak and to listen and teach. We always say at PRIM&R that everyone's a teacher and everyone's a learner, because everyone has something to share and to say. So the conferences were launched and never stopped. I think that, again, we learned very quickly that there is great strength in numbers. And when the proposed regulations came out in '79, there was, by then, Donald Chalkley had retired from the Office of Protection for Research Risks, and there was a new director named Charles McCarthy who came to PRIM&R and who was just, from the beginning, as committed a partner as we could have asked for. And that, again, was one of those liminal moments where I said, this is going to build PRIM&R, because if the federal government agency that's responsible for the area in which you're working is a solid, committed, and entirely ready partner, then you've got credibility and certainly a lot of visibility. So Charlie McCarthy brought the draft regulations to the PRIM&R conference in '79, seeking our audience's input. And that was, again, the best this community could have hoped for. You mean we can help shape these regulations? And he said, come away, bring it on. Tell me what you like. Tell me what you don't like. Tell me how to make it better, them better, the regulations. Because he knew that if there was input from, investment in, and certainly a sense of ownership of the regulations, or at least participation in the process of developing the regulations, a sense of ownership in developing the regulations, then compliance would be a lot smoother and easier. And he is so wise. He's 88. He just turned 88 last Monday. And he's so wise. He's a former Catholic priest and just a wonderful, wonderful human being. But he actually said, give it to me straight. Tell me what you think. Call it as you see it. And because of that iterative process where he brought a few different successive drafts of the proposed regulations on protecting human subjects to PRIM&R conferences, the final version, which was finally published in the Federal Register in 1981, was the result of discussions, dialogues, debates, and sometimes shouting matches at the PRIM&R conferences. So that was a huge moment where I knew we were making, and had made by the time of the publication of the regulations, a difference. Clearly, having a voice in the regulatory process was huge. Having a contract with the President's Commission to write the guidebook was, again, a huge impact that we saw when we finished it, because that was sent to every research institution.
Do you remember what year that was?
That was '81. And that's where I first started to work closely with Alex Capron, who's now our board chair, and another very cherished mentor and friend to me and really one of the luminaries of the field, since he worked with Jay Katz on the seminal book in our field, Experimentation with Human Beings. Alex was Jay's collaborator and co-author, and he has been true north for many of us in this field. So that was 81. And I think another important impact that we had in the 80s was when HIV/AIDS, when the pandemic was first identified. Again, there was no place for all of the stakeholders to come together. There were places for scientists to come together and talk about it, places for activists to talk about it. But PRIM&R was the first place where everyone, activists, people affected directly by HIV/AIDS, lawyers, certainly researchers, research staff, legislators, ethicists could come together. So that was another place where I saw an immediate impact. And the proof of that impact was that C. Everett Koop, who was then the Surgeon General, came to a PRIM&R conference and gave a keynote and thanked me personally for having this conference. And he was a remarkable man. We developed a friendship that endured almost to the end of his life, and was someone who I admired greatly, despite the fact that initially it would have looked on paper like he and I might have been oil and water, but we became fast and great friends. So those were just three of the examples how we saw impact. We saw impact on regulatory input, we saw impact on President's Commission guidebook, and we saw impact in being there when HIV/AIDS struck to bring everyone together to talk about the ethical and social issues. As I recall, after the first conference in April of '77, it was clear that we had a national audience. It had long since been clear that this was a national problem, which was why PRIM&R was founded. And I think our board was very wise and understood that if it was seen as a bunch of researchers from Boston, which was often seen in turn as researchers from Harvard, it would not only be limited in its scope and breadth and impact, but that they would be communicating the wrong message, because they acknowledged from the beginning, we don't have answers. No one has answers. There may be no answers. There may be no answers. But we want to bring people together. So this notion and ultimately proposal to make it a national organization was a way to operationalize their desire to not make it seem like a elitist, East Coast-based, particularly Boston-based group of people. And they knew that there was wisdom in every corner of the research world, and you could only tap it if people, again, felt that they were part of it. They didn't want to be just the magnetic field that brought people together, particularly that brought people together in Boston. They wanted to be the conveners, but to have the same stature and contribution and right to be at the table as everyone else. So I think it was just a move to make it broader, non-elitist, and to ensure that no one saw this as, there goes Harvard and BU and BC and Tufts telling everyone what to do. Mostly Harvard, but they were very wise.
Were there any practical implications of that decision, do you think?
Well, the positive practical implications were, and they didn't all happen at once, but certainly slowly, we started to have board members who were non-Boston based. We started to have conferences that were non-Boston based, although again, that took a while. We started to talk about ourselves in our newsletter. I used to type a little periodic newsletter as a national organization. Again, it was self-anointed as a national organization, but it truly reflected the composition of our audiences. Even at that first conference, we had people from California, we had people from Texas, we had people from many, many states. It was remarkable because we had no way of knowing where these hand-mailed brochures would land, whether they'd land, and who would come. but it was national from the beginning in composition of audiences and attendees in our meetings. So it felt right that we should call ourselves a national organization. The PRIM&R founders, when they met for the 2 or 3 years running up to the first conference, and certainly CERBIM, which had in its name chairpersons of IRBs of Easter Mass, were by definition local and limited. But once it became clear that we had something that was hopefully helpful to others around the country, we wanted to expand the net and certainly expand the way we saw ourselves, hopefully driving the way other people would see us. Full confession, I'm a frustrated doctor. I always wanted to be a doctor. I loved my childhood pediatrician. I had a friend from college who went on to become a nurse. I just really felt that was a very important way of helping people. Again, this predated my activist streak and all of that. But I think somewhere down deep, I always was interested in medicine, and that's why Leonard Glantz and George Ennis's class on children at risk and health law, the health law aspects of that course really spoke to me. But I think that once I started to work in the health law firm, I realized that as a lawyer, I was going to lack the vocabulary of medicine and science. And I also felt that I wanted to be able to bridge the two worlds, law and medicine. There were very few health lawyers back then. Again, they were either hospital lawyers doing contracts and malpractice cases or labor law, or they were malpractice lawyers. And this whole new field of health law was exploding, with patients' rights a piece of it and part of it, and ethics, health law and ethics being a part of it. And there was one famous New Yorker cartoon, which I love, which showed two people at a cocktail party and holding their obligatory glasses of something, wine, cocktails, and one says to the other, "I inhabit that shadowy world between law and medicine." And I think in order to really inhabit it, to be immersed in it, you have to have the lexicon and some of the tools of medicine and science. And so I decided that I wanted to go get a public health degree. Another reason why I decided to do it is that Bill Curran, who's considered one of the founders of health law, who was a professor, the Francis Glessner Lee Professor of Health Law at Harvard, was starting to get involved with PRIM&R and with Neil Chayat. Neil had worked with Bill Curran when he was himself a young lawyer at Bridgewater State Hospital in Boston, which was the subject of Tidicott Follies, the famous Fred Weisman film. And so Bill Curran started to advise PRIM&R and come to one or two of our meetings when it was just the small group, talk to us about health law, and I admired him and liked him. And in some of our conversations, I think he suggested to me that I look at matriculating at the Harvard School of Public Health and getting to the degree. And he encouraged me, saying that you will be a more successful and knowledgeable health lawyer if you have the tools of science. And so I went and I enrolled as a student, a master's student in the Health Services Administration. There wasn't a health law program as such, but Bill did lead a subset of the Health Services Administration program, 8 health lawyers. We were 8 people, and we were able to take some health law courses with him and one other health lawyer. And then we took the regular curriculum, biostatistics, epidemiology, maternal child health, and the regular stable of public health courses. And it was a wonderful move, both in terms of the people I met, particularly those from around the world. It was already a very international student body at the public health school, and the skills and increased tools that I was able to develop by dint of that degree. I really always felt much more comfortable in the field of health law having that degree than I did as only a lawyer. Others do well as, without the degree, and others, get more degrees, business or medicine, in fact, PhDs, but it's been a great combination for me. I think that I was already determined to become a health lawyer by the time I did that. I had met Bill Curran before I did that. If anything, it just reinforced my activism, because it was a a student body that was very progressive, and so that was just a good place for me. BU was only starting its program the year that I entered Harvard. That is a really terrific public health school, but they had no funding, and I had to get some funding, so I couldn't go there. But it was a student body that was very activist, and that was reinforcing for me. It didn't change my direction in any way. I was already working at PRIM&R. I was already working with Neil Chayat. I already knew Bill Curran. And so it was just a lovely addition to my knowledge base.
During these years, as you mentioned a little bit earlier, you were also involved in several other work endeavors, and I just wanted to bring them in for a minute. During law school, you worked on a prisoners' rights project, also at the Executive Office of Human Services for the Commonwealth and in various law firms. So I wanted you to talk for a minute about what drew you to these particular endeavors and how they helped shape your developing understanding of important issues in health legislation and in sort of legal medical issues.
I got a job at an independent nonprofit called the Prisoners' Rights Project when I was in law school. I had seen a number of black people arrested in the civil rights days and had tried as a high school student, as a college student, to go visit young black men in jail when I was in Selma. People would come to me and say, "Robert's in jail, can you go do something?" And of course I couldn't do anything, but I would go visit them. And the conditions of confinement were so upsetting to me that I was interested in trying to, again, make change. This was before law school. That was another reason I had originally wanted to be a lawyer for kids or young people, because I saw so many young black men in jail. And so I got a job with the Prisoners' Rights Project and decided that what I could offer them, because I already had this love of health law by then, was helping inmates who were having health problems, medical problems. And so that began a very long interest in the health and welfare of inmates. And so I became their point person on inmates who needed surgery, or inmates who needed medicine, or pregnant inmates at the Women's Institution at Framingham. And there were several extraordinary experiences that I had. I also helped inmates who were mentally ill. There was an inmate named Kenneth Myers who needed an organ transplant. He had, one of his kidneys was entirely shot. He was an inmate incarcerated, and they did not want to give him a new kidney because he was an inmate, and they thought it would be a waste of a kidney. So I was his advocate and working with him and with some hospital administrators at the Lemuel Shattuck Hospital to try to find him a hospital that would treat him. He was dying. And I called every hospital that I could find in a 10-mile radius, and basically people hung up on me or wouldn't take my call, and certainly nobody was interested in helping an inmate. And then somehow, I don't remember how, I found my way to New England Medical Center, and someone suggested that I call a young nephrologist. This was almost 40 years ago, a young nephrologist named Andy Levy, and that he might be able to help. Someone said he was just a really remarkable man, and that if anyone could help you, Andy Levy could. And so I called Andy Levy, and he said, "Come on over." I went over and we talked, and he said, "I'll meet him." So Kenneth Myers was brought in shackles to New England Medical Center. Andy Levy not only met him, but he treated him and he transplanted him. And I believe he transplanted him twice with 2 kidneys. I can't be sure of twice, but I know he transplanted him once. And Andy Levy became my hero, and we're now friends and neighbors, and it's been a wonderful relationship. And my admiration for him was from the minute I met him and has never stopped. I also worked on cases where people who were psychiatrically ill were put into solitary confinement. And I worked really hard on those cases because basically they were driven crazier, and I'm sorry to be so colloquial, but they were driven crazier by this solitary confinement. So I worked very hard to get them treatment and to take them out of solitary confinement. And that worked, that dovetailed with some of the issues that later certainly arose in terms of PRIM&R's work. Again, the National Commission looked at research with prisoners. National Commission looked at research with those who were decisionally impaired. And so I really had a very stark front row seat on what it's like to be decisionally impaired, what it's like to not have capacity, and what it's like to do research in prisons where people feel they have to say yes because they know that there will be consequences if they don't oblige to go along with the program. So it's certainly, Prisoners' Rights Project was very important work, both for my activist soul and for my health law soul. The other law firms in which I worked, I did women's health work and civil rights work. I worked on criminal cases where people were accused of crimes they didn't commit, including a rape case in Brighton, Mass, where a man was unjustly charged with raping women in Brighton and was ultimately exonerated because he was not the rapist. I worked on a number of women's health issues, including women who suffered because of IUDs, the Dalkon Shield, the Copper 7, women who had been given unnecessary hysterectomies, unnecessary cesareans, women who had become addicted to Valium, women who had had breast implants that had burst or leached. So the whole range of women's health. I worked on toxic shock cases. And so that too gave me an inside perch on how women, particularly then when there were few women physicians, were often very vulnerable, especially vulnerable and often exploited as patients and certainly as research subjects. So it was all part of a whole, even though at times, and certainly looking back, it looks like a series of unrelated posts, but it all just reinforced my belief that research subjects, and certainly patients in general, need advocates and need to ensure that the professionals that they encounter in their journeys for health and well-being are not just knowledgeable about ethical issues, but are committed to practicing in an ethical way or conducting research in an ethical way.